And then when it comes to kind of your advice for cultivating belonging, you see, you split into these three pieces of grounding, having kind of self-knowledge and self-love. And I think the grounding part we've kind of covered, I guess, some with the trauma and trying to become embodied and feel your feelings in an embodied way. But then there's also this component of being disconnected from land, right, which seems to have also been a kind of product of colonialism.
Yeah. So these 5 steps that are not sequential because nothing really ever is. But I do think that it does start with grounding, at least, because that disconnection from our bodies and from the ways of knowing that aren't only about our conceptual mind and rational thought, which has been so conditioned by our language and our culture. So kind of returning to that intuitive knowing, which also returns us, like you were describing, to things that we just inherited that need to be undone. But when we can do that, and when we can meet whatever is there, what we start to know, so ground yourself, know yourself with some measure of like kindness at the very least, and really compassion and love in a deeper level, so that it's really held with this understanding where it comes from. From there, we can connect, and the connecting for me really starts to bring this practice into balance. So I feel like ground yourself, know yourself, love yourself is mostly internal, and connect yourself starts to help you recognize that we are not separate part, right? And so really feeling that connection to land, to earth. I'm a big proponent of the elements practice, which is a classical mindfulness practice, but actually we don't practice it very much in modern mindfulness circles. And it really, I find, connects you to the elemental nature of our existence, so that earth, water, fire, air, these like very basic metaphors, you start to realize in practicing with them, like how connected we are to land, to nature itself. We are nature.
Right. And then on the connection between trauma and self-knowledge, especially when it comes to our kind of ancestors and where we come from, there's this amazing part where you talk about, I think it's called indigenous focusing oriented therapy. Is that right? And it seems to be kind of teaching that trauma isn't this pathology that's, you're broken in some way, something's gone wrong, but it's actually wisdom that's teaching you, in certain circumstances you're not safe and you need to be vigilant. It's an adaptive response.
Yeah, for me, that it's just a slight kind of reframe, but it really helps with being able to hold our trauma, to recognize that, and it's really great that there's a growing understanding of trauma. And I hear in some circles, especially with young people, people talk about it almost like we only inherit trauma, that we don't inherit resilience. And what I love about IFOT is that it kind of reframes our trauma as resilience, right? So I use the example, the kind of classic experiment with, I think it was mice or rats, where they were exposed to a scent, and every time they were exposed to it, they were shocked or kind of experience pain. And over time, they started to fear that scent. So anytime they feared that scent, their anxiety would go up, and their cortisol levels, and they would basically have a stress panic response. And what happened was that actually the children of those rats or mice and the grandchildren also had that fear of that same scent, never having experienced the shocks in relationships. So really showed, and there are also studies on humans that show that we can inherit this kind of trauma response. But it was actually smart, right? Like those mice were kind of prepared by their ancestors to not go towards something that would harm them. And so when we can experience it that way, I find that we're able to let go of it without aversion. Like we don't sort of bring the same trauma or upset to it that actually started the cycle in the first place. Like we're actually and in this indigenous practice that I've been trained in, there's a lot of ritual and ceremony around acknowledging that, and so being able to release it with some sense of gratitude and resilience.
You also talk about this idea of considering 7 generations, like the importance of knowing 7 generations in the past and considering 7 in the future, which seems like a very wise way to, I guess, to act from a place of connection, but not just in the present, but also through time.
Yeah, and I was so struck by that because I started to notice when I heard the term 7 generations, which is usually attributed to an Iroquois teaching and North American Indian teaching, that it reminded me of this tradition we have in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I'm sure in other places too, of acknowledging 7 generations of our lineages. And so I just was struck by the number being the same. And many years later, I learned through looking at ancestral information that the 7th generation is when there is less than 1% of the DNA passed down. So there's something in that knowing, in that indigenous way of knowing, that acknowledges that actually that is the maximum amount of time when that knowledge and that wisdom is actually passed down genetically.
Yeah, that makes sense, because after 7, it's kind of all coming out in the wash. You're so many people at that point that there's no real influence from any particular strand.